December 17th, 1944, 0620 hours. At a small headquarters building near Nancy, France, officers of the U.S. Third Army noticed something unusual in the German radio network. For days, the air had been filled with scattered transmissions, coded bursts, and routine chatter. But now, almost suddenly, the German signals went quiet. Long, unnatural silence replaced the noise. Most armies could go silent for a few hours, but the Wehrmacht never did so without a reason. At that moment, far to the north, the artillery of 3 German armies was already pounding American lines in the Ardennes. But in Patton's headquarters, no one yet knew that thousands of German guns had opened fire. They only sensed that something was wrong, something deep, something that experience alone could detect. The only person who fully understood these signs was a quiet, meticulous man who always seemed to be carrying a stack of reports. Lieutenant Colonel Oskar Koch, Third Army's intelligence officer. For nearly a month, Koch had been piecing together fragments of a puzzle. German panzer divisions disappearing from the front line. New ammunition depots appearing in Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs. Reported troop movements at night. 6th Panzer Army relocating without clear purpose. Most intelligence officers dismissed these signs as defensive repositioning. But Koch didn't. On November 26th, he placed a map on Patton's desk and said, "General, I believe the Germans are preparing a major offensive. Not small, not local, a major one." Patton listened. He always listened to Koch. Koch was cautious, analytical, and, most importantly, rarely wrong. Germany was losing the war. Logic said they couldn't launch a massive attack, but Koch didn't work from logic. He worked from evidence, and the evidence was unmistakable. The decision that changed the Battle of the Bulge. Patton summoned his operations chief, Colonel High Maddox. Maddox was the opposite of Patton in temperament, quiet, methodical, and famously unflappable. While Patton was lightning, Maddox was the grounding wire that made the lightning useful. Patton gave him a simple but outrageous order. "Height, prepare 3 plans." "For what operation, sir?" "For a German attack in the north." "But that isn't our sector." "I know, that's why you'll prepare in secret." So began one of the most unusual staff operations of the Second World War, the creation of battle plans for a battle that had not yet begun, in a sector where Third Army was not supposed to fight. What Maddox had to do, Maddox faced tasks that contradicted every page of the field manuals. Prepare to turn an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of combat map movement routes more than 100 miles north. Estimate fuel requirements for thousands of vehicles. Determine which divisions could disengage fastest. Hide all preparation so no one, not even American commanders, would notice. And all of this had to be done without written orders, because written orders could be captured. Every night, Maddox gathered his planners behind locked doors. Maps covered the tables. Roads through Luxembourg were examined one by one. The weight limits of bridges were checked. Alternate routes were drawn, some nothing more than forest tracks. To most officers, Maddox explained it as a training exercise, a theoretical scenario. But in truth, it was the quiet beginning of one of the most ambitious logistical maneuvers in U.S. Army history. December 16th. The silence breaks at 0530 on December 16th. More than 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire. Entire American regiments were smashed within minutes. Communications broke down. Reports flooded in. Enemy armor breakthrough. Battalions overrun. Panzer units on the main roads. Koch entered Patton's office without knocking, a sign of absolute emergency. "It's begun, General." Patton nodded. Everything Koch had predicted was now real. Third Army still had no official orders, but within hours Patton quietly began preparing to move. His divisions started repositioning. Fuel stockpiles were pre-allocated. Engineers began surveying roads. Maddox's secret plans were about to become real. December 19th, the Verdun Conference. This meeting would become legend. The room was cold, the walls covered in maps of Belgium marked with red and blue pins. At the table sat Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, General Omar Bradley, General George S. Patton, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Major General Harold Bull. They faced a crisis. 200,000 German troops had smashed through the Ardennes, creating a massive bulge and threatening to split Allied forces. Bastogne, a small Belgian town, was now surrounded. Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the question everyone feared to hear. "George, how fast can you turn your army north and attack the German flank?" Most commanders would have needed 10 days. Some would have said it was impossible.
Patton replied instantly, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Silence filled the room. Bradley stared. Montgomery later said he simply didn't believe it. Even Maddox, who had planned every detail, felt a chill. What Patton promised was beyond the limits of logistics, doctrine, and common sense. Eisenhower leaned forward. "Can you really do this in 48 hours, or is this optimism?" Patton answered, "It's not optimism, My staff has already begun preparations." And that was true. Patton could promise the impossible because Maddox had already built the foundation for it. Why Patton could do what no one else could because Third Army had been living into realities. Officially, preparing to attack east into the Saar secretly, preparing to turn north toward Belgium. No one else on the Western Front had contingency plans this advanced. No one else had divisions pre-positioned. No one else had fuel caches already moved north. No one else had engineers surveying roads before the order existed. This was not improvisation. This was deliberate, careful, hidden preparation. Patton gave Eisenhower the 48-hour promise on pure confidence, but Maddox was the man who made it possible. The movement was now only hours away. Patton left Verdun shortly after 13 o'clock on December 19th. Snow had begun to fall again, led at first, carried sideways by an icy wind flowing through the Meuse Valley. His driver, Master Sergeant John Mims, pushed the jeep hard over the frozen roads. The situation was too severe, too urgent, for anything slower. Patton's destination, E-Corps headquarters, the formation assigned to lead the turn north. There, he would give the order that no one thought possible: to halt ongoing attacks, disengage from the enemy, rotate the entire corps, and begin a forced march toward Belgium. By the time Patton arrived, the sky had turned completely gray. Inside a cramped command post, maps were spread across tables, radios crackled, and officers moved rapidly between sectors. When Patton entered, conversations stopped. The room snapped to attention. He didn't waste time. "Gentlemen," he said, "we attack north toward Bastogne in 48 hours. No explanations, no debate, just execution." Major General John Milliken, commander of E-Corps, stared at the map. The distances looked unreal. Road networks were thin, crossing points limited, fuel reserves low. But orders were orders, and Patton was not a man who tolerated hesitation. Milliken nodded. "Well, move, sir." The mechanics of an impossible maneuver behind Patton's promise lay a labyrinth of details. The transformation of Third Army from an east-facing force to a north-striking hammer required an orchestration unlike any other of the war. Colonel Maddox now took center stage. His job was not to inspire troops, his job was to make the impossible actually happen. In his operations room, officers clustered around maps with colored pencils, grease markers, and transparent overlays. Maddox issued movement tables, exact departure times for each division, designated march routes, priority for armored versus infantry units, fuel intervals, and engineer checkpoint. Every mile of road had to be assigned to someone. Every bridge had to be inspected. Every convoy needed spacing to prevent traffic collapse. What made Maddox exceptional was not speed but clarity. He intuitively understood where a single choke point could ruin the entire timetable, so he built redundancies: primary, secondary, and emergency routes. If a bridge failed, there was another crossing. If a fuel depot ran dry, another would be ahead. If a column stalled, traffic could bypass it. As he spoke, staff officers scribbled notes, ran to telephones, drafted movement orders. One of them later wrote, "It was as if Maddox saw the battlefield from above. Every unit was a piece on his board, and he knew exactly where each piece had to be and when." The conditions: snow, darkness, and chaos. Night fell early on December 19th. The temperature dropped sharply. Fog began rolling up from low valleys. Yet the movement began anyway. Convoys formed in darkness. Engines idled low to conserve fuel. Vehicle headlights were covered with small slits of black tape, so-called blackout lights, creating nothing more than dim blue dots on the road. Drivers followed each other by distance alone, often no more than 10 yards apart. Along critical intersections, military police stood for hours in the cold, directing the long, endless columns. A jeep driver from the 26th Infantry Division later recalled, "You couldn't see more than a few feet. You just prayed the guy ahead of you didn't miss the road." The logistical burden was staggering. To move 3 divisions simultaneously required over 11,000 vehicles, tens of thousands of gallons of fuel, 24-hour road control, constant traffic regulation, repair crews ready at every turn, even in perfect weather. It would have been difficult. In winter, on frozen European roads, under blackout conditions, it bordered on madness. Disengaging from active combat, the Corps divisions were not resting in the rear. They were fighting the German army along the Saar at the very moment Patton issued the order to turn north. The 80th Infantry Division was engaged in heavy action near Saarbrücken. Rifle companies were dug into frozen fields. Artillery batteries were supporting attacks. Machine gun platoons were locked in exchanges with German defenders. Then came the order: disengage and prepare to move north. 2 infantry officers. This was worse than attacking. Pulling back from contact meant exposing flanks, giving the enemy initiative, risking counterattacks. Commanders planned night withdrawals carefully, pulling platoons back one at a time, using covering fire, making sure the enemy did not notice until the movement was complete. General Horace McBride, commanding the 80th Division, later wrote, "It was the most delicate maneuver we performed in the entire campaign. One mistake and a regiment could have been overrun." The 26th Infantry Division, positioned near Metz, had been preparing to attack eastward. Their entire logistical framework faced the wrong direction. Ammunition dumps pointed east. Communication lines ran east. Artillery was zeroed on eastward targets. Now everything had to be reversed. Artillery units limbered their guns. Signal Corps teams tore down wire networks. Engineers gathered explosives and bridging equipment. Infantry marched to new assembly areas. The 4th Armored Division, closest to the turning point, had its own problems. Its tanks had been fighting for weeks. Track pads were worn down. Fuel pumps leaked. Engines needed tuning. Maintenance crews worked through the night with lanterns and flashlights. Sparks flew as mechanics replaced track links, all stained the snow. Men worked with bare hands and freezing air to tighten bolts that would not wait for sunrise. Some crews slept inside their tanks with the engines running for warmth. The roads through Luxembourg. The movement of E-Corps passed through Luxembourg, a country with limited infrastructure. Roads were narrow. Bridges were old. Villages were small, with tight corners impossible for long convoys to navigate without careful control. Maddox team positioned military police at every junction. They carried signs with arrows, whistles, and lanterns. Some stood for 16 hours straight. In many places, engineers examined bridges before heavy tanks crossed. If a bridge was too weak, engineers built bypasses or reinforced the structure with additional beams. Some tanks crossed streams by driving through shallow sections, water rising to the hull. Civilian witnesses later recalled entire nights when American vehicles passed nonstop. An unbroken chain of trucks, guns, and tanks rolling north toward a battle that had barely begun. Patton on the road. Patton did not stay at headquarters. He drove the routes personally, stopping at checkpoints, speaking with military police, encouraging exhausted drivers, inspecting stalled convoys, and redirecting traffic with his own gloved hands when bottlenecks formed. One MP wrote in his diary, "He appeared out of the snow like an apparition, a 3-star general waving at us to move trucks faster." Patton understood something simple. Momentum was survival. If E-Corps stopped moving, Bastogne would fall. Conditions in Bastogne. While 3rd Army advanced north, the situation inside Bastogne grew worse. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and supporting units, had arrived just in time to close the perimeter. But supplies were grim. Artillery shells were rationed, medical supplies were nearly gone, fuel was scarce, snowstorms prevented air drops, wounded men filled cellars and corridors. By December 20th, Bastogne was fully surrounded. German forces attempted to seize key crossroads, probing the American defenses constantly. Panzer grenadiers supported by armor conducted repeated assaults, testing the perimeter for weakness. On December 22nd, German officers approached under a white flag and delivered a surrender demand. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply, "Nuts," was defined, but it did not alter the fact that Bastogne was on the verge of collapse. 48 Hours reaches its deadline at 5:45 on December 22nd. American artillery of E Corps opened fire south of Bastogne. At 6 o'clock, infantry and armored elements crossed the line of departure. Exactly 48 hours after Patton's promise in Verdun, E Corps was attacking north. Not waiting, not preparing, attacking. The impossible had begun. At 6 o'clock on December 22nd, the lead elements of I Corps surged forward through the frozen morning darkness. Snow crunched beneath tank treads. The muffled explosions of artillery rolled across the hills. Infantry rode on the backs of Shermans, clinging to metal rails with numb fingers, whispering jokes they barely believed to keep themselves awake. The counterattack had begun. Patton's 48-hour promise, dismissed as reckless bravado, was now a real military operation, moving, firing, and advancing toward the most desperate American defensive stand of the Second World War. The Germans were not expecting an attack from the South. German intelligence believed the Third Army was locked in combat near the Saar. Reports from the German 5th Panzer Army assumed Patton would take a week minimum before any reposition units could strike. So when artillery from E Corps opened fire, German commanders were caught unprepared. Forward German units radioed confused messages. American armor approaching from the south. Impossible. Verify. But it wasn't a mistake. It was the first sign that the Ardennes offensive, the last strategic gamble of the Third Reich, was beginning to unravel. 4th Armored Division takes point. The spearhead was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey. Its mission: push through the rugged terrain, seize key villages, and open a corridor straight into Bastogne. Combat Commands A and B advanced on parallel routes, probing for weaknesses, fighting through minefields, machine gun nests, and fortified crossroads. Progress was slow. The terrain favored the defender. German forces used ridgelines, forests, and small stone villages as natural fortresses. Every advance required careful coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery. But the men of the 4th Armored had something powerful driving them forward. They knew American paratroopers were surrounded. They knew time mattered. One tanker later recalled, "We didn't need a speech. We knew those boys in Bastogne were counting on us." The struggle for the villages south of Bastogne. The first major obstacle was the village of Bougainville, a heavily fortified position held by German paratroopers. Houses had been converted into strongpoints. Anti-tank guns were hidden in barns and behind stone walls. Machine guns covered every approach. 4th Armored's Combat Command Reserve struck Bougainville at dawn. The fighting was brutal and slow. Shermans fired into buildings. Infantry cleared rooms by hand. German defenders fought from cellars, using grenade chutes carved through floorboards. It took an entire day before the Americans controlled the village. They were still 20 miles from Bastogne. Meanwhile, the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions advanced on parallel axes, pushing German units back, widening the corridor, and keeping pressure from the flanks. Patton monitored every hour of progress. When one village slowed the advance, he sent a message that became famous: "We must get to Bastogne. Press on." The weather breaks, and everything changes. December 23rd dawned with a thin blue sky, the first clear weather in days. This mattered more than anything. Suddenly the Americans had their greatest advantage back: air power. C-47 Skytrains roared over Bastogne, dropping crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and radio batteries. Parachutes hung from trees. Soldiers cheered as boxes slammed into snowbanks. Meanwhile, P-47 Thunderbolts began striking German positions. Hunting vehicles and supply columns caught along the narrow forest roads. The effect was immediate. German units that had been advancing confidently now slowed, hid in forests, or reversed direction. Several panzer divisions reported fuel shortages after Allied aircraft destroyed convoys along the main supply routes. Patton later said, "God cleared the skies and the Air Force did the rest." Christmas Eve. The push narrows despite air support. The drive toward Bastogne still lagged. Terrain and German resistance continued to slow the advance. Patton met with Gaffey and Milliken. The conclusion was stark. A broad assault would take too long. They needed a single, focused breakthrough. The commander chosen to lead the thrust was one of Patton's greatest battlefield talents, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion. Abrams was fearless, quick-thinking, and tactically brilliant. He understood armored warfare instinctively. His tank Thunderbolt was already known among his men as a symbol of aggressive leadership. Patton trusted him completely. December 25th, the assault on Assenois. The key to Bastogne was the village of Assenois, a gateway to the final miles leading into the besieged town. German forces had fortified it with veteran paratroopers, anti-tank guns, and roadblocks. Snowdrifts hid mines. Every building was prepared for defense. At dawn, on Christmas Day, Abrams launched his attack. Artillery pounded the village for 20 minutes. Smoke and dust turned the sky gray. Flames rose from shattered farmhouses. Then the Shermans advanced, infantry riding on their backs following the rolling barrage. German defenders sprang from cellars as soon as the shells lifted. Panzerfaust teams fired from windows. Heavy machine guns raked the streets. A Sherman at the head of the column exploded, blocking the narrow road. Abrams did not slow. He ordered the column to push through, to flank where possible, to keep pressure constant. His command tank roared into the village, firing point-blank at German strongpoints. One officer later wrote, "Abrams did not fight battles. He punched holes in them." By mid-afternoon, Assenois belonged to the Americans, though burning, shattered, and still under artillery fire. Only the final dash to Bastogne remained. The breakthrough. Cobra King makes history. Abrams chose Lt. Charles Boggess to lead the last push. Boggess commanded a heavily armored Sherman jumbo named Cobra King. It was built to absorb punishment, exactly what the spearhead needed. At 16 o'clock on December 26th, Boggess and his crew accelerated down the road from Assenois toward Bastogne. German machine guns fired from the woods. Artillery rounds crashed nearby. Infantry and half-tracks followed close behind, firing at flashes in the tree line. But they did not stop. They had orders. Reach Bastogne today. At 1650, Cobra King crested a hill and saw Duggan troops wearing American helmets. Unsure whether they were Germans in disguise, a tactic used earlier, Boggess stood in his turret and shouted, "Identify yourselves." A tall American lieutenant stepped forward, waving a helmet. 326th Engineers, 101st Airborne. Come on in. The road to Bastogne was open. The siege was broken. Euphoria and immediate danger inside Bastogne. Paratroopers cheered as tanks rolled in. Men shook hands, slapped armor plates, and embraced soldiers they had never met. A medic recalled, "It felt like the sun had come up after a week of darkness." But the battle was far from over. The corridor was thin, only a mile wide, and both sides shelled it relentlessly. German forces attempted to cut it repeatedly. Ambulances and supply trucks ran a gauntlet of artillery and small arms fire. Engineers spent days clearing the woods and securing the flanks. Meanwhile, the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions continued to push outward, widening the corridor inch by inch. For Bastogne, the crucial moment had passed, but the fight would continue for weeks. German reaction. Shock and confusion. The speed of Patton's maneuver stunned the German high command. Field Marshal von Rundstedt later admitted, "We did not believe the Americans could shift an army that quickly. Our calculations said it was impossible." General Manteuffel, leader of the 5th Panzer Army, confessed that Third Army's movement forced him to divert entire divisions, intended for deeper exploitation of the Ardennes corridor. German records show Panzerlehr halted its drive west, 2nd Panzer pivoted south. Instead of east, fuel shortages skyrocketed, reserve deployments became chaotic. The German offensive designed to split the Allied front was now reacting defensively to American pressure. A strategic thrust had devolved into a desperate struggle to hold ground. Aftermath. The Bulge collapses by early January 1945. It was clear the Ardennes offensive had failed. German spearheads had no fuel, no air cover, and no reserves. Patton's E-Corps pressed north. British forces under Montgomery pressed south. The Bulge shrank daily. Hitler refused to withdraw, demanding attacks that were no longer possible. German commanders watched their armored strength already dangerously low bleed away in the snow. By the end of the campaign, Germany had lost irreplaceable tanks, veteran infantry, thousands of trucks, entire ammunition stockpiles. The last chance to seize the initiative. The war was not over, but the outcome was now inevitable. The legacy of the 48-hour turn. Historians often credit Patton's audacity and charisma, but the deeper truth lies elsewhere. The miracle was made by staff officers, logisticians, engineers, MPS, drivers, mechanics, and thousands of unnamed soldiers. Hymatics, who planned the movement. Colonel Muller, who found the fuel and ammunition. Traffic controllers who froze for hours. Drivers who stayed awake for 2 days straight. Mechanics who kept the Sherman engines running. Infantrymen who marched at midnight through snow and ice. Without them, Patton's promise would have been a fantasy. With them, it became reality. Modern militaries today study the Bastogne relief as a masterpiece of operational mobility. The ability to shift entire armies rapidly while maintaining combat capability. It was not magic. It was preparation, discipline, and the relentless determination of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. The final image in a well-known photograph taken weeks later. Patton shakes hands with Anthony McAuliffe outside Bastogne. Standing in the background, barely visible, is Brigadier General Hymatics. He is not smiling. He is not posing. He is holding a clipboard, already planning the next movement. And that is exactly where history places him. Not in the spotlight, but behind it, quietly ensuring that impossible things became possible.